Hi guys, so welcome to the Heart Centered Visionaries platform. I'm here today with Nicole to talk about her work and obviously bring you some wisdom and talk about her personal journey. So Nicole is a storyteller and also the creator of Mythos Podcast, which I highly recommend. It's beautiful, telling all these folk tales mainly from Eastern Europe. I think you'll explain more, but what I have listened to is really inspiring as an artist. It opens my mind. So here's Nicole. Welcome, Nicole. Thanks for
Hello. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for wanting to chat about your work. And how are you? How are you doing with all this intense energy at the moment?
Pretty good, actually. It's been pretty good. I think it's interesting because with storytelling, it's a body experience and it's an emotion experience, and it feels like all of your past and your present and your future comes together, in your heart and your mind and your body when you're telling a story, especially something that's you're deeply attached to, whether it's culturally or emotionally. Perhaps it comes from important part of your past or cultural heritage, or it represents something important or difficult or beautiful and triumphant in your life. I do find that a lot of energy comes into that process.
Yeah, beautiful.
So,
Did you find you work with the energies and how you're feeling to create the stories?
I do. I think the big thing for me with stories is that I love them because, and particularly traditional stories, but I think narrative in general, the reason why we love it is because it doesn't ignore the really dark and the difficult side of life. And I think oftentimes we can do that at our peril. And I don't think it's necessarily a spiritual thing to just ignore, the things that are dark and difficult, the things that make us anxious, even depressed, those things that bring difficult emotions. And I find that traditional stories, folk tales and folklore, and really narrative generally, but I find particularly traditional tales help encapsulate, they help bring together the really, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as it were.
But that's so beautiful. I think that's why I'm drawn to your work, because with, astrology, it's like the symbology, the symbols and the myths are talking to the psyche on a deeper level. So it's like a very healing experience. And so it's beautiful what you do with the symbols, I guess, or the stories you're, like you say, bringing out people's the good, the bad and ugly to help them almost accept that, would you say, in some way?
Yes, there's definitely, I think, a sense of acceptance that you have because you realize that you're not the only one. And that can come in a variety of ways. That can be in traditional stories, or when we read biographies, for example, or we watch documentaries about people's lives. There's something deeply settling and centering and comforting to know that even the things that bring us shame, and that's a tricky one, isn't it? That emotion, things that bring us shame, that we are not, more than likely, unless we've had a truly bizarre life, that we are not the only ones who experience that particular thing. I do the podcast, the Mythos Podcast, and my overall vision for it is to actually do a world tour of folklore, myth, and legend. So my first series was Lord Britannia, so it's British folklore, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. The second series was Folklorica Slavica, so it is a great deal of the Slavic countries, particularly some of those being Eastern European, and then Scandinavian folklore. And I plan to just tour the world with the podcast. Yeah,
that's amazing. So did you, because I know a little bit about your work, and obviously we met in a networking event, which is great, and So how, what inspired you to first start the podcast? What was it that led you
It
to
was a few things. First, my grandfather was a phenomenal storyteller, but he operated mostly in the oral tradition. He was illiterate, so he read pretty widely for his education level. I'm pretty sure he probably graduated high school, but he grew up in Ohio in the Great Depression, so I can't imagine a lot of resources were available to him. But I remember he was particularly gifted at making up stories on the spot, and he would include me as a character.
Oh, wow.
Yes. He had a series of stories also called Squirrely Whirly, which was a squirrel that had a tail like a helicopter that flew and went on adventures.
That must have been so much fun as a kid.
Oh, yes. But he would include me too as a character, for example, facing, difficult, monsters on a really basic level, or, difficult villains. And I would find clever ways of dealing with the situation. And so that was one of the things, is how emotionally full I felt with that. The other thing is, because I have a literature degree, so I think one of the things that was always close to my heart was myth and legend and folklore when we would touch upon it. And I think the last one would be Angela Carter. She's a writer, and she put out a quite seminal collection of fairy tales. And she makes this incredible statement in the beginning, in an introduction in the book, that folklore and folktales are the closest thing we have to the imagination, the collective imagination of the working poor who built our world. Those anonymous people who will never be known to history. That's the closest thing we have. And there's something about encapsulating that, and for heritage, for culture, and for our own identities.
I think that's so important. Wow, that's incredible what you shared, because I think as a child, children are so, playful and in the moment, aren't they? That I imagine that really inspired you to kind of be creative in some way, or kind of, open your imagination, particularly as a role model. Was it quite did it connect with you when you were younger, and you think, I want to do this later? Or was it just sort of more of an unconscious thing that was sort of planted?
I think it was more unconscious, because I just grew up with it. And it's interesting you asked that, because it was later in my life. I grew up in quite a working class family in Ohio, and I didn't leave the state until I was probably 17 or 18 years old. And I then started working, and I eventually went to uni. And it was interesting. I was meeting people from many sort of backgrounds and classes. And I remember when I was hanging out with people's families, I thought, oh, they don't really tell stories. It just struck me that I just thought, because my family generally would do a lot of that, repetition of legends, local legends and urban myths, or family stories and family legends. Yeah, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I thought, oh, this is kind of a lost art.
Definitely. And also what you said is, I think what you were saying earlier, it's almost like stories connect people, particularly the stories in the family. Like, I remember how many times my great nan used to repeat stories, but I'm glad she did, because then I actually remember the stories. If she hadn't, I might have forgotten them, and they're often kind of, somebody outside might think that's not really interesting, but to you, like you said before, it's like part of your identity, that's where you come from. So I think it's so important to keep those down the line. So then what led you to, so you said you studied, what was it you studied?
I did literature at uni, generally. So, and I also had an MA in literature. Yeah. So, that was important, because I did encounter a number of, novelists that would use folklore and myth and legend, would tap into that tradition for their own creative efforts. And that was really common with post-colonial literature. So writers from the post-colonial world, various African nations, India, places like this that would have been under British rule, it seemed like oftentimes in order to recover a sense of political identity, people would often tap into, the myths and legends and folklore of their more traditional roots. So I always found that fascinating. But it also made me realize that folklore, myth, and legend, and magical thinking that you often find, that is not for children only. That is also for us, because what I've realized through oral storytelling, because I do performance storytelling through the podcast, I write personalized folk tales for people. And the big thing that I've realized about folklore is that it is real to the bone. These are stories about what it is for the world to demand more of you than what your resources allow. The nitty gritty of that difficulty that we all face, whether it's a situation or a relationship or even our own desires, and the feeling that you don't have the resources to meet that. And we've all been there, haven't we? Just, the feelings of inadequacy, of not being fulfilled, and sometimes even feeling guilty, that we're not content enough, or all of the things that happen. And folktales always make us face that. But it's the magical thinking that is just emotional vulnerability incarnate. It expresses our longings for resources that are beyond us. And that could be magical resources that you find in a wilderness, the place you would least expect it. It seems like a wild place. You would never find anything to help you, find that wealth, or to find that princess, or to find that lost city. And yet, help comes from unexpected places for those that are open to it. And folk tales and folklore seem to always convey that in such beautiful images. And that's why I love telling, connecting people to that kind of thinking. And it's interesting to me that stories and narrative are also really important in helping to diffuse our internal narrative. It's this thought interrupter. We can kind of throw the curveball really to our logical filter when we listen to stories. We can pause that for a time. And it's interesting, I have a number of visual artists and people who have contacted me to tell me how inspiring, for example, the podcast is just to listen to when they're doing creative work, because it just frees up their spirits really, and takes that logical filter and just calms it down.
That's beautiful. No, I love so much of what you say, because it's true, our mind is so active, right? When do we actually stop and be in stillness? But actually, I think, like you said, storytelling is a great way to get out of that and get it. It's almost like dropping into the heart, dropping into that deep yearning within you. That's what I've noticed from your podcast. And as a very visual person painting, it's true, it opens up something in your brain. It unlocks almost the part of you that you haven't connected with. And I love what you're saying about, this idea of uncertainty, how it's almost like it's opening up a possibility for what is possible. It's kind of like I see this sort of idea of this infinite wisdom that we can tap into through the stories. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and it's that softening of the heart, isn't it? It's it's always really central in those traditional stories. It's funny because even the one thing I don't shy away from would be the scary stuff. You've probably noticed in the podcast. The monsters, the things lurk in the night.
Exactly.
In scummy algae-covered ponds and high mountains. Those spaces in the wild that actually are dangerous too. And I think for a couple of reasons. We have so little, as modern people, there's so little space to feel bliss and the sublime. Now, it seems kind of odd to say that in terms of a kind of a scary story, but you know, that feeling of grandeur that a good monster gives you.
Mm. Yeah, but I
And
love.
so, yeah, there's that feeling of the grandeur of nature and of the universe and life. It's so grand that it's even a little bit dangerous.
Mm.
And there's something to that. But it's also, it helps us face, again, that feeling. It gives a form and a kind of a symbol to that feeling of just being overwhelmed, of things seeming too big for you, you know, the things you want to ignore. And, you know, whether that's facing really shameful circumstances in therapy, you know, in there. But how often in a story, when I'm immersed in a story where a character has to deal with or faces a beast or a monster or something powerful, nothing's resolved necessarily, but it just assuages something, it comforts something. You know, you're facing the shadow, as it were.
Yeah, well, that's exactly. I love that what you're saying, because I think it's, you know, what I've listened to so far on your podcast is it's like delving into those places, you know, when you face the shadow, you face your fear through that monster as you describe. It's like it doesn't seem as big anymore. It almost seems to take, you know, symbolically takes that stress away or that intensity away, because you sort of accepted it. And I think from what you do is would you say that the work you do is really so it really helping you connect with the shadow part of people? Because I think this is a big thing in this world, is like we have to look at the shadow parts of ourselves, right, and move forward and move into wholeness. I get that, you know, from your podcast, is it's about kind of as well moving into wholeness from that space of accepting all the parts of yourself. Would you say that resonates with what you're doing?
Oh, certainly. It certainly does. And I think too a great deal about sort of the oral and traditional storytelling that I do. So just to give some examples of that, I meet with a group of storytellers kind of in the Ringwood area. And that happens once a month. And it's a pretty common thing actually throughout the UK. And I know increasingly in the US and various other places where you have storytellers who come together, and they typically will bring traditional tales and tell them without reading. You know, you memorize them and then you deliver them. And it's interesting because there's a couple of things that happen. One, sometimes stories are told completely in earnest. And a good example of that is a friend of mine who told a beautiful story. It was actually written by Oscar Wilde. It was a fairy tale about a humble king. And at one point, when this humble king, he's entering a great cathedral to be coronated. And he has decided, because he's seen all of the suffering that has gone into making his robe and crown, he's seen in a dream all of the suffering, the mining, working at the looms, you know, in this old Victorian factories. He is distraught and decides he's going to put on humble clothing, and he's going to go to the cathedral, and he's going to be coronated in this incredibly humble garb. And he arrives at the cathedral, and the people and everyone, they're angry at him, right? Because he's making them a laughing stock through this humble approach, this humble clothing. You know, all the other nations are going to consider them weak and poor if, you know, he's not showing up in this regal gold. But there's this beautiful moment where this light shines through the glass of the cathedral, this beautiful, brilliant beam of sun. And it hits the young king's head where he has a circle of thorns, which, you know, the symbolism is very obvious there, isn't it? The circle of thorns, or the crown of thorns. And then it lights it up so that it looks gold. And there's these little flowers of light that begin to grow, and the sunlight hits his poor clothing. It makes it look like a golden robe, and all the people see, and, you know, the bishop says, "It's obvious who has crowned you." And it's interesting because in that moment, everyone was just, and the storyteller got really choked up when the young king decides to not wear the fine clothing. You could see it. There was just, everyone pauses and he gets choked up because it's just this really beautiful and simple longing for, the Christ figure, really, for the humble leader, for the wise and humble leader who looks to not all of the ego nonsense about what makes a person great, but looks at spirit and decides what greatness is. So it's those moments. If anyone's listening, can actually get involved and just go and listen to oral storytellers, like in that kind of story in the round or club format. A friend of mine once put it well. She said, "I just feel so settled."
That's beautiful. Well, now I can see, even you just telling that story, it's like your inner child or my inner child just lights up because, there's so many metaphors in there that just connect with you on a psychic on your psyche level, right? It's working really deep, it feels. And I think from what you said there, it's important that we all, I guess storytelling is giving us a channel for us to find a sense of vulnerability, sense of connection with people as well, which is so important in this world, particularly at this time. So I'm interested, you're saying about the storytelling as a group. So how does your process work from you if you take a story and then to create it into one of your recordings? What's your process like?
Well, that's interesting. So it's a little bit different so the podcast and oral storytelling would work slightly differently. For Mythos, I just read really widely. It takes me actually months to do the research for the podcast. Because you're not only trying to find the stories, which sometimes they can be difficult to find. These collections of folklore, sometimes it's kind of encased in more sort of academic language. So it takes me a long time, and even with the Baltic series that I'm doing now, some of those resources I had to ask a friend in Lithuania
to
buy for me. Yeah,
that must be tricky. So where do you find the resources? Are they mainly through people you know, or you just?
So I use a variety of things. I use JSTOR and academia, which are two academic resource databases, Google Books, so some things are available online, some things I can buy and order, but some things can be really tough to find, and I have to spend a bit of money. So which is why I set up a Patreon page, because I just really needed a bit of obviously financial support to make that happen. But I also research sort of the environments and the cultures that would have these stories would have existed in, is something else I do, because there's going to be a lot of things that are lost on us as modern people.
You're sort of adapting it to where we are now, the modern
just trying to get people immersed in that mindset. So, for example, getting lost in a forest. In Norwegian folklore, there's a term, it's hugstølen, and it refers to a person who seems to have, it's kind of with the fairies, that phrase that we have, but in a sense of trauma. And it's a phrase used oftentimes for people who've gotten lost in the wilderness, right, and have finally been found and have been traumatized by that. And I needed to research a really Norwegian landscape, let's say, and how long it would take to go from, a valley to the mountain farm.
There's a lot of details in there, I can imagine.
Yeah.
People probably think, oh, you just tell a story and record it. And I can imagine it takes a long time. So what are your favorite folk tales, or what kind of area of the world are you most drawn to?
Oh, that's a hard one. I do tend to be drawn generally, not necessarily to a specific, I think, culture per se, but I am drawn to stories that take place in kind of, they're obviously pre-industrial. So seem to have the values and the life structures and ways of people that would have existed on farms in the middle of nowhere, really.
Mm-hmm.
And because I find that mindset fascinating, and I also think we have something to learn from it, and a lot to remember. There's a sense of real gratitude and even admiration that I feel when I think about the people who produce these stories, the challenges they faced, and what we know what it is to be human, our loves and our hates and our family fights and family conflicts, and how sometimes our personal desires will conflict with the culture that we're in, and how do you handle that? And there's some comfort and wisdom, to be had in that.
It's amazing. I almost see it as like it could be therapy, because I know before you were saying about you can explain more, but I feel like you spoke about you're targeting the change makers, the creatives, the people that are here to do, like the visionaries. Is that who you'd say that this podcast is for? Like, who do you think that you aim this at? I'd love to hear more about the vision, big vision.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes. No, I'm really excited about it because I started with the podcast. It's all been a bit of a journey and really an experiment to see what was it that I wanted. Many people who are listening, and you probably know that feeling of, at first it starts off a little bit vague and you may just have one little specific idea. But it's amazing how it's grown. So I started with the podcast. And the aim was very much, in many ways, like artists and sensitive souls and people who just, want that little bit of immersive escape from, I think in many ways, our culture, which is so enamored with functional rationality. And it plays its part, but I think some people probably feel a lack of soul. So I kind of initially came out that way, and was really just a kind of artistic expression project for me in many ways.
Beautiful.
And I'm developing Mythos Storytelling, which is very much about creating space. It's where creatives and change makers and seekers of all kinds can find inspiration, kind of new world inspiration through old world storytelling. So the podcast is a part of that, but I'm going to be launching a 6-week webinar on what is power, and tracing the idea of power through world folklore. I mean, I'm going for a range, like every continent is going to be represented in some way.
So how can people find out about the webinar?
So I don't have the website up yet because I've been redoing it, but it will be in about a week's time. I'm going to have Mythos Storytelling live, and the workshop is a pilot, so it will be reduced in price. Beautiful. And yes, so you'll be able to find all the information at mythosstorytelling.com.
I will put your links in the...
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. It's going to be up in about a week's time because I've just been reformatting and doing all the things that take forever.
Well, it sounds so fascinating because it can go so many different directions, and I think with it can appeal to so many people, can't it? At this time, I think people as well at this time are seeking a safe space to retreat to, as you said. And I think particularly creative people, and I can relate to this, that we often feel misunderstood in the world in some ways. There's a sense of people feeling different, and we want to be able to connect with ourselves, but others on that level, and be in a space where our imagination is open, and that's okay. That's what I see in many creative people, that they are more free spirits, and they need to explore their psyche in a way, like you say, time to retreat and time for themselves, which seems...
And there's so little space oftentimes in modern culture. It's changing a bit, which is nice, for you to explore soul, that the idea of spirit and soul, and that we need that fed as deeply as we need our bodies fed and watered, or we have all sorts of things that happen to us. We feel isolated, we feel inadequate and weak. We get that ruminating circular thinking going, and we overanalyze ourselves, and
Completely.
all of that stuff that happens when we're not given the opportunity to space kind of practically, to explore those big things, love and power, and what it means to have a soul, what it means to suffer and to triumph. And the webinars I'm excited about, because it's, I want to use like centering practices, a bit of storytelling, discussion, which Martin Shaw, a storyteller, calls feeding the story.
Beautiful.
You discuss the story and you're feeding it as a group when you do this. Little mini teachings on maybe the psychotherapeutic aspects or the symbolic aspects and cultural aspects of the stories. And all of that, what I'm aiming for is, if you're a creative, for that to give new life to your work. If you're a change maker in this world, that maybe it gives you a repertoire of stories or new strength to make the changes you want to see in the world. If you're a seeker and you want to explore these things.
So you're going to be telling a story like each week, or how does it?
The way I'm envisioning it at the moment. So if I look at the idea of power, so what does power mean? So it'll be at the moment 6 to 7 weeks, maybe one evening a week. So it'll be obviously online at this stage. And generally the structure will be at the beginning, some kind of centering exercise, because it's hard to engage with things when your mind is in disarray. There might be in the beginning a question centered around a theme, and it could be something like feeling small, injustice, what we tend to do if we feel powerless, what does real power look like, that kind of thing. So there'll be discussion, and then I will tell a story, just in the traditional oral storytelling form, extemporaneously from my head. Tell a story, and then people will also respond to the story. And then also I want to give space for, if people write poetry, if they have insights, if they have a story they remember, or if they do a piece of artwork, to be able to share that.
Beautiful. So it's like, it sounds amazing. So would you say that, what would you say the benefits of doing this course? How will it help people? Because I can totally see, as a creative person myself, that would like really like open my mind and kind of connect with these themes on a deeper level. Is that your vision for it?
Yes. I think there's just a number of benefits that, from my own experience, because in many, I'll say it this way, what I'm kind of recreating is what I've been experiencing for probably the past 5 or 6 years now, through both the podcast and through the oral storytelling. So I've seen a few things that it's really incredible for kind of creative and intuitive distraction. So sometimes we can ruminate so much on things that we just think ourselves into a ditch. It's like, if you drive into mud and your wheel keeps on turning and you just keep pushing on the gas, but you just get yourself in a rut, and you really need something, a tow truck to lift you out. And what I'm hoping is, both through like that interpersonal connection and through the stories and through just that distraction, that maybe it can be a bit of a tow truck. In the same way, I do feel that things like judgment, low mood, that rumination, that they just need to be interrupted. So you have that pattern and thought interruption. Also having, if in your own creative work, for example, having a new repertoire of stories and insights to use in your own initiatives, your own creative work. There's also, that chance to network with other creatives and change makers and like-minded people.
Beautiful.
That connection with personal and world heritage, that's a deeply settling and enriching experience as well.
I like that you say settling, because I think it is comforting. And I think as creative people, we are quite sensitive. So to have that space to emerge your soul, like do the soul work, is so important. And I'd love to know, you've spoken about your granddad, and it's really great to hear what inspires you. So how would you say that storytelling has actually affected you? How has it helped you in the time you've been doing it?
Well, I'll go ahead and just get up close and personal. You might as well, huh? You might as well. The past few years of my life have been some of the richest times in my life. And I can't, I'm not saying I was always miserable before, but the only way I can explain it is that I felt like my inner life was a constant battle. And I was pretty high functioning. I was teaching and performing really well in my job, and I'm sure everyone, was happy with that. But God, let me give you the list of things I struggle with. I mean,
So
moments of yeah, exactly. There's just moments of depression from that constant overthinking and rumination. I was struggling with eating disorders, incredible feelings of shame and embarrassment if I made the slightest mistake at something. And I was going to a therapist, and I went through a major depression for 6 weeks. I could barely move. And it was awful. And through all of that, definitely, therapy, I'm like, yes, you go to your therapist, you find a good one and you go to one. But the other thing that was so important for me was I spent most of my life feeling that my sensitivity to life, my love of beauty, my obsession with spiritual growth, those were always weaknesses. Always. They were liabilities. And I just felt so much trapped. I don't even have a word for it. It's just that I needed to get out. But finally, I feel like storytelling and combining storytelling with spiritual practice, really meditation and centering, has been an incredibly healing thing for me.
Beautiful. And that's so, thank you so much for sharing, because I think so many people experience depression and have those struggles that they almost feel shame around, or they feel they can't ask for help, right? And as you said, therapy is good in different ways, but it sounds like that storytelling really helped help you channel that, whatever that was, that kind of thing that you needed to express.
Yes.
So do you think it's helped you? Were you working with it like day to day for the last couple of years, did you say?
Yeah, I would say it's that combination of, interestingly, so it's a combination, I think, of, in therapy. And I had a really wonderful therapist. There was no pet theory that she espoused. She just focused on me as a person. And it's interesting, a large part of that was rehashing my life story and reframing my life story with her. So I was doing that at the same time as exploring traditional storytelling. And I think that was a powerful combination. It's interesting because I am going to retrain as a counselor as well for that reason, and look into narrative therapy, I think, as more of a provision in the future for Mythos, because that combination was powerful. It really was, of reframing my life story in therapy, but also reconnecting to that storytelling heritage. So, yeah.
Beautiful. And as well, I think we all, as people, like you shared, we get so much into the head that we forget about the heart. And actually, I know I've worked with so many creative people that their inner child, they've neglected that inner child part of them, that part of them that needs to play, and they shut off the connection to their joy and their excitement in life, so I think through that, any self-expression for people, I think, is key to work with that and heal as you've done, which is amazing. And so what would you say for people right now, if they are interested in storytelling, like how would you say that they could start working with it, maybe as a, daily or weekly practice? Where would you say to start with that?
I would say the very first thing to do is to watch Storytellers. I think it's mostly because, as I've said, it's in many ways kind of a lost tradition for modern people. And the best way to see all the possibilities, the creative possibilities of expression, is to go watch. So in England, really an excellent organization called the Crit Crack Club has storytellers, traditional storytellers from everywhere, all cultures, walks of life, performing on a regular basis. So their website, critcrackclub.com, is an excellent starting point for that. Also, if you would go to the Society for Storytelling, their website, you can also find groups. So groups that might be close to your area that meet. And it could be a combination of having, for example, visiting storytellers come and perform, but also people just telling their own. And then after you've watched, give it a try, maybe just for 5 minutes. Because what I found with at least my group, and I've heard many other people say, is that really kind and supportive people tend to be attracted.
There we go.
Yeah.
It's the intuitive, so people, highly sensitive people out there calling to you. Beautiful. There's a theme there. It is. So would you say that, have you seen that people, because often I see this so much, as people say, oh, I'm not creative, and they say, oh, I can't do that. And I said, well, maybe you haven't found your outlet yet. That outlet that works for you. Do you find that with storytelling, that people say, oh, I'm not creative, and they've kind of shut that down, and then probably this amazing story emerges from nowhere, and they're really
yeah, with a bit of structure and guidance and support, I think probably a number of people have discovered that it's in them in the first place. But you've just got to, it's tough, isn't it? Because as adults, we tend to be really pigeonholed as we get older. And in some ways, it's, not anyone's fault per se. It's just the functioning of society depends on, us playing a role. But we get so pigeonholed, we fail to realize that if we haven't tried it, we have no idea. And there really are really safe spaces to just give it a try. And if storytelling, if, this is awakened just a little spark in someone, going to those clubs and just listening for a while, taking it in and then giving it a try, follow that little spark. 'Cause that's what I did. It was just a little spark and it turned into something really beautiful.
That's amazing. But it is that spark, isn't it? That's the spark. That's what you need to follow, that inner guidance that that is often so hard to do, isn't it? But it's this quote that I love is like, leap and the net will appear. When you take a step into the unknown, then things will evolve, like you said with your podcast. So you just start with the idea. If you have an idea, just start with the idea, and then things will evolve naturally, right? I would say. So so I'd love to hear as well, because obviously you've been on this path of self-discovery through what you experienced that led you to storytelling. What words of wisdom would you say to people on this journey of self-discovery, for them to kind of, maybe not storytelling, but just in general, what would you say that you've learned from this process that you want to share with others?
I think for me, it was, and it happened a great deal through the storytelling, I said, through therapy and through the oral tradition, but not ignoring my shame, but actually making space to figure out why I felt it, to actually tell the stories that hurt, to let them come out of my mouth to another human being that I trusted, to actually speak them so they weren't in me wreaking havoc. That was a huge, huge moment where genuine healing started to happen, and where, funny enough, I would just have these moments of peace descend on me in those moments of honesty, and they hurt like hell. Oh, how sometimes you face it and you think you're gonna die. I honestly, when I first was telling, facing these shameful things, I thought I was going to die at times. And then when I first started storytelling, sometimes the anxiety would almost eat me alive. But what I knew, the shame and the anxiety, they're hard emotions. And of course, the one thing I will say is make sure that you're with a trained and capable person when you're exploring these things. That is for sure, that you have a strong network of people. But if you don't turn away from shame and anxiety, there is a kernel of life. There's a truth inside of those things that's been hidden away about, your abundance as a human being, about your sacredness as a human being, your holiness, your worthiness, and all that you're able to give. It's buried in those tough emotions. And whether it's personal storytelling with a therapist or that oral tradition, and you're exploring the really tough stuff, give yourself space for authentic exploration of those things in a safe place, definitely.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's so, you say about shame, I think that's a big thing, isn't it, for what holds us back in life. And often people don't even know what that is. They're not aware of it. But I think in anything, it's like the acceptance, as you said, the acceptance of that shame kind of opens something up. And even though it is hard, I think that the healing process, that's important to acknowledge things that just get buried deep, don't they? So,
yeah.
So that's really powerful wisdom. And so as well as obviously your 6-week webinar and your podcast, which I highly recommend to anyone, it's amazing. What else, do you have anything else coming up that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, so I also plan, and this will be on Mythos Storytelling, the website, I'm also piloting at the moment, which has been very successful and popular, a service to do personalized folktales as a gift.
Oh, wow.
So the idea is that I get to know a person's kind of life story, their cultural heritage, the music they like. There's a little form that they fill out. But I just take all of that information. And I usually use an existing narrative frame. Let's say if you have a Russian background, I might use a Russian fairy tale, and I insert the person as a character. And of course, the whole story is them encountering some conflict and finding means to overcome it. So I'll be offering that, as a service. So it could be a gift to yourself or to others for large life events. It could be, a boy's bar mitzvah. You get an old Jewish tale written for them, or what have you, as a personalized gift.
That's really powerful. I love that. Yes, definitely. Check it out. Please let us know. And I'll be I really want to know about that. That's fascinating. No, I just think that's such a beautiful gift to give to ourselves, right? We are worthy of so much. So that's really lovely. So when will you be launching that? Are you hoping to?
I started a pilot recently, so I will definitely say probably at the beginning of next week, I'll be ready to, take orders, as it were, and move forward, because I've got it all planned and plotted now. So that's exciting.
Beautiful.
So that will be ready.
That sounds amazing. I'm so looking forward to seeing that, Nicole. And thank you for sharing your journey and sharing what you do with us. And I will leave the links so everyone can check it out. And maybe you can come back again. We're hoping to maybe do some workshops and things. So maybe you can come back and do a story. We'll leave it open. Thanks, Nicole.
Sounds good.
All right.
That's all right.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.